Hello, I'm Dan Baxter, and welcome to Constructive Thinking. Today, we're chatting with Mike McDonald about everyone's favorite topic, pipeline politics, especially from a BC perspective. Mike, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be invited, Dan.
There's a lot kind of going on in the world of politics today, especially when it comes to getting things built. There's been a lot of conversations around getting nationally and provincially significant major projects built, and I think what's really taken a lot of oxygen in the last little while is Premier Smith's most recent announcement to be a proponent, to lead the proponent side of a pipeline from Alberta's oil sands to BC's west coast. I know you had a podcast on your Hotel Pacifico with Erica Barutz and Cheryl Oates. It's a great podcast called The Discourse in Alberta for those who want to listen in and get the lay of the land there. What do you take on that decision, and how do you see that impacting with BC politics?
Well, it's definitely already shaping out to be a divisive debate. I think it's always been the case, at least through the work I've done in public opinion research, that the mainstream British Columbian supports major projects. Mm-hmm. And I've seen research in the last month or two that when you put the proposition of an oil pipeline to the Northwest Coast, majority of British Columbians support it. And that was the case in 2013 when I was involved in the campaign with Christy Clark, when Adrian Dix opposed the Kinder Morgan pipeline. I think it created a lot of economic angst with regular voters, those voters in the suburbs and people paying their mortgage. You need these projects to build an economy. Even if you may not like it, if you don't want to admit that you're supporting an oil pipeline, you still think it's needed. Mm-hmm. So I think that's an interesting backdrop. Now, the problem for Premier Eby is that the people that oppose the oil pipeline live inside his political party. And there's people in his party that would support it too, but it's a divisive debate for him, managing his own political coalition, especially as he's heading towards a leadership review in November. So I think, he's taken a stride position because he needs to show that he's going to speak up for the environment at a time when the NDP have pivoted on LNG. They've taken a step back from where Horgan was. Eby has now come back to the table to support LNG at a cost politically within some parts of the NDP coalition. And I think he needs to say, okay, well, I'm good with LNG, but I'm not good with oil. And he's trying to make that case within the NDP. So Danielle Smith's doing what she has to do in Alberta to advocate for it. And I think the politician who's got the thorniest task ahead is probably Mark Carney. Mm-hmm. And in terms of how he decides he's going to approach it at the end of the day. He may just try to work with process for a while and not have to take a really hard, fast position, but he's either going to lift the tanker banner or he's not.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things to unpack there. I definitely think, the situation for Prime Minister Carney is the thorniest. I agree with you. But again, we hear a couple of things that are kind of permeating in the conversation. I think first, and we can maybe unpack both of them. First, David Eby saying, we are going to take a lot of projects off the table in BC. It's going to cost us economically. I'd love to get your thoughts on whether that's a true statement or not. At the same time, also federally, Prime Minister Carney does have the constitutional authority. Like you said, he can lift the tanker ban. It's an interprovincial pipeline, so that jurisdiction does rest with the federal government. So he kind of holds, I don't want to say trump card, but he kind of holds the trump card here. If he wanted to do the pipeline, obviously he doesn't have to make a decision right now, but how do you see let's maybe first tackle that first part about, Premier Eby's, contention that if we somehow advocate for a pipeline or that's advanced, it's going to cost BC economically in terms of other projects.
I think it's dangerous rhetoric. I think he makes it riskier by saying that, where major projects have agreements, those agreements will hold. And last time we checked, the agreements are in place where, for instance, the PRGD pipeline heading to Silisms. Here you have an Indigenous-led project that is not without opposition, but by and large, coming out of the Coastal GasLink experience, most interests were in favor. People want the jobs, they want the revenue. First Nations equity discussions come a long way in the last decade. And so it's really quite incredible what these projects can do for economies up north. And I don't think anyone's seriously looking at scuppering those types of projects that are going to deliver those benefits because an oil pipeline is being proposed. So I think that's a bit reckless. So I'm not exactly sure what he's referencing. Is he referencing shipping out of the Port of Prince Rupert? Because the Port of Prince Rupert has outstanding support from the local community and the Tsimshian nations up there. So I don't think they're looking at it's covering those opportunities. So, I think it's a bit hollow, frankly. But where I think there is a point, though, is that we do got to get those LNG projects done. Like phase 2 LNG Canada and the Silism's LNG project. They stand to contribute significantly to provinces and Canada's GDP, create a lot of jobs, create a lot of investor confidence. I think I heard Tim Hodgson say the other day that the Silism's /PRGT project would be the second largest project in Canadian history. I think LNG Canada might be the first.
I think it is.
So it's like, well, let's not screw that up. But I don't think having a debate over an oil pipeline should screw it up.
Yeah, I think we are able to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what kind of banana republic do we live in?
Yeah, well, that's it.
So answer that question.
Yeah. Yeah, because, speaking of the broader country then, again, what do you think Prime Minister Carney is? Obviously, there's not a pipeline proposal yet. This is Premier Smith putting in the legwork. And actually, that's actually another issue I'd love to maybe unpack a little bit more with you, because obviously, she's created this Crown Corporation. They're doing a lot of the upfront kind of technical work that a private sector proponent would do. And of course, we hear another argument saying, well, this is a Crown Corporation doing it. Why should government be in this? There's no private sector proponent, so it's going to cost taxpayers a lot of money. Are they going to be the proponent all the way through? I think my take on it is that there's just been no proponent to this point because, like you said, it's just the uncertainty around the regulatory environment. They don't want to basically kind of touch it, not knowing whether it will actually be approved or not. So Alberta's kind of taken the lead on that. But Can you unpack that a little bit from your perspective?
Creamer EVs. There's no project. It's not a real project. It's a fantasy pipeline. They keep saying that. And it's like, well, gee, I wonder why there's not a private proponent for a pipeline to the North Coast. Let me think about that for a second. Is it because when Kinder Morgan was advancing their pipeline expansion and, previous decade that the provincial government of BC took it to court, that there were massive protests that were frankly condoned by many in the political class? Could it have been that, British Columbia at the time was basically a jurisdiction that was hostile to that project? Not the majority of the population, as I said earlier, but from, a certain part of it, right? Could it be, is that why the federal government bought the pipeline? Yes, absolutely, right? So why would a private company want to go through the approval process and the permitting process in that kind of environment? It has to be government-led. I think TMX, now that it's built and it's operating and everyone seems to be lovey-dovey about it, and the NDP government wants to dredge Burrard Inlet or supports dredging Burrard Inlet to maximize the output. And I'm happy they're taking that position now. But it's Enbridge or whoever that might look at a northern pipeline. It's like, we're not going to go through that kind of brain damage to do that. So Premier Smith has stepped up to do it. I don't think that's a reasonable position for the Alberta government to take. And it's definitely in the interest of their economy to increase market access. Now, I don't know the ins and outs of what the demand is and whether that pipeline, there's a business case for it or whatever. I'll leave that to the experts. But if someone's willing to risk money to build it, I don't know why we would stop them. And maybe Keystone's comes back and maybe that's an easier thing to do and maybe that works out for everybody as well. I don't know. But if somebody's trying to build the economy, wants to have a serious conversation about the environment and the First Nations interests along the way, then let's have the conversation.
Yeah, I think this now loops kind of back into where Prime Minister Carney is kind of coming to you'll have to come to a decision at some point. Because I heard the points about TMX not being, and of course I hear some people call it TMX, TMEP as well has also been kind of used out there, but we'll call it TMX. TMX is underutilized right now, and obviously there is some investment that can be done to get it to full capacity. And so people say, well, we don't need a northern pipeline right now because we haven't even fully utilized TMX yet. And it just makes me think of say something like Roberts Bay Terminal 2 with the port. We talk about, well, we don't need it right now. The numbers aren't there to support it. Yeah. And you always want to think long term. I think economically in terms of a time is going to come where we need all that capacity, whether it's for our oil product or for terminal capacity, container terminal capacity. And if we don't start building these things now, by the time we do need it, we'll be behind the 8 ball. Do you think that's going to factor into Carney's decision? In terms of obviously he's not going to want to make a decision right now because there's nothing to make a decision on, but he's got to be thinking about those things long term, no?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a window of time here where Carney has a lot of political capital, not just with the public, but also within the Liberals. He saved them in that election in a shocking fashion. So I think he has a very strong hand to pivot hard in terms of where the Liberals go compared to where they've been. And that means navigating through people like Stephen Guilbeault and Gregory Roberts and others who may not be keen about that, and maybe they'll have to reconsider their positions or their political careers. But the world has changed, and Carney seems to be a man of the moment in terms of here's a guy with a global outlook who understands how money moves between economies and understands, I hope, the need to have diversified economy and basically currency to use in the global arena. Like when we export oil to Asia, we're strengthening Canada's sovereignty. We're strengthening our muscle in the global arena. When we tie our hands behind our back, we're weakening ourselves as a country. And I think Carney gets that. I hope he does. It's not to say he's going to be around forever, because he might lose the debate within the Liberals, or he might lose the plot with the public. I don't know. This is potentially a bit of a Nixon goes to China scenario where it takes a Liberal prime minister to bring along the centrists and the left-leaning, some of the left-leaning population to go get some of these big projects done. Because we know if it was Poilievre was prime minister today and he was advancing an oil pipeline to the northwest coast, oh my God, the acrimony coming from the Liberals would be intense, right? Yeah. So let's make it their idea in this particular window of time in the next year or two to do these things so that they get done.
Yeah, excellent. Obviously we'll see where this all kind of lands over the next year or two, like you said. And I really appreciate your insight on obviously that most kind of top of mind topic right now. I know a lot of our members, our contractors are the guys that get these things kind of built. And so I think they're interested to see what the reality is, the likelihood of a project that an oil pipeline kind of being built from Alberta to BC's coast. But with that being said, let's maybe dive in a little bit deeper around the politics of labor here in BC. Obviously, you're a person who has a little bit off mic from the 91 campaign when the NDP came in and Socreds were defeated and an upstart BC Liberal Party came around. They took on the mantle of the free enterprise movement. Obviously, many years working within the Gordon Campbell government where we worked together to, eventually running Christy Clark's campaign in 2013 to turn around victory and being our chief of staff. You've probably seen it all here in BC. So just love to get a little bit of your perspective of how you see, kind of the politics of labor and how it plays out, and, just offer any insights you might have on that.
Yeah, what really has set BC apart from other provinces in Canada historically is that our economy here was really founded on more of a boom-bust structure, I guess. When you look at the prairies, it was agrarian, it was gradual development, and people working for themselves in a lot of ways, right? Farming their land and selling their crops and so forth. Whereas here we had big mines that were set up, coal mines, and we had gold rush and huge influxes of people and capital in short periods of time. And with that came polarization that developed over time between, kind of a class-based system or between employers and employees or labor and capital, however you want to look at it. And, that really formed the identity of BC politics. And when I think back in the time machine here, there were moments like in 1941 when there was a minority government and the CCF almost came to power, and the Liberals and Conservatives formed a coalition to basically that kept the CCF out of power. And then 1952, a crazy change to the voting system for 2 elections blocked the CCF from taking power. And even then, they weren't as a Labor-backed party as the NDP would become in the 60s, and that's when polarization really took off. And fast forwarding to the 1970s, there was the first NDP government with David Barrett. The pendulum swung hard towards labor, organized labor, and then it swung back in 1975 when the Socreds came back. And it really peaked in 1983 when solidarity marches and province general strike and things like that happened. So I say all that just to see that's what really shaped BC politics up until fairly recently. Labor stood with the NDP and business stood with the Socreds, or later on the BC Liberals. It's not quite that way now. I think climate and environment have been more, or have emerged, and also like identity and social justice have emerged as more important themes within the NDP than labor.
Huh.
And I think that's created some movement in organized labor on the private sector side. I know in the 2017 campaign, I think the iron workers endorsed Christy Clark, right? And you've seen that in Ontario, right, with Doug Ford, and he's made a serious play for organized labor. I looked up in advance of this interview, I looked up some election results. There's a riding in, East Kootenay that actually used to elect a labor member, a unionist.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't even want to elect a CCF and NDP, or they went right to a labor guy. This going back some years, and then they elected NDP for a long time. But I looked at a recent election in Elkford and Sparwood, which are company towns with a highly unionized workforce, working in the coal mines. 69% BC Liberal in 2020, and they voted Conservative in 2024. The NDP aren't even on the map. That just painted a picture that there's been a change, right? It's workers. The NDP coalition's gone public sector union, but also left-wing causes, a bit more environment, and they've become more urban and less rural, less resource community. So last election, the BC Conservatives won North Island, and took that away from the NDP, and that reflects people working in as loggers and salmon farms and those types of jobs. The NDP have got very little game in the interior of BC. And the consequence for government is that when they're in power, they don't have those voices now at the table. They're still making deals with unions like on public sector projects, as you know.
Yeah.
But I think a part of that is to keep them on side, because they know that the union leaders might still be with the NDP, but a lot of the private sector union workers have gone out the back door.
Yeah, that's interesting that you highlighted some of those number shifts in Sparwood and Elkford, in terms of, obviously supporting BC Liberal, supporting Conservative. You kind of did some similar analysis, obviously not to the depth of the numbers that you have, but I always used to highlight communities like Nelson Creston. You look at the map and it would be deep, deep, deep orange, for provincial politics, but solid blue for federal politics. And, it just seemed like such a dichotomy. Whereas now you're right, we sometimes, think, oh, union boss equals rank and file workers, where, obviously a lot of these people are making their own decisions on what's the best interest for their job, for their family. And that it's not just a clear, if we get the union bosses, we get them, even though that is what's happening. And I'd love to, kind of unpack a little bit of the community benefits agreements with you from a political point of view with the government, because obviously you're right. That's a big thing for our members where, we say, obviously people think of labor in the traditional sense. There's the traditional NDP supportive unions, the hiring halls, siloed. Each trade is its own craft, and it's represented by a kind of a broader umbrella group called the building trades. And then you've got your non-union people, and never should the two meet.
Yeah.
But obviously there's, from our point of view at the Progressive Contractors Association, there's this third way, this alternate way where you get the benefits of both. You get the benefits of the unionized structured workforce. At the same time, you can still have the same efficiencies of a non-unionized model, which helps us to build projects more efficiently. How do you see the politics of labor playing into a decision? Because you kind of alluded to it, that obviously you keep the NDP on side, the labor on side. The NDP obviously gives them access to public sector projects.
I think what's becoming painfully apparent in the last few years here is that the government's finances are a complete mess.
Yeah.
And the cost of building these major projects is ballooning, and there's major cost overruns. I don't think government's going to have a choice pretty soon when it comes to finding ways to do these projects more affordably. So I think where there are agreements made that inflate the cost of projects, governments of all stripes are going to have to be a bit more pragmatic about this, or we're just not going to have many projects being built, or fewer projects that cost more.
Yeah.
So, I think that when you say third way or alternate ways of doing that, that's supportive of that. I mean, you mentioned Site C was done on kind of on that basis. So I think that's just something that maybe 5 years ago people weren't as concerned about because BC's fiscal situation was stronger. We were in COVID. It was just like, just get it done, just let's not worry about the money, worry about it later. Well, now we got to worry about it. Like, for those who aren't aware, BC's debt situation has got dramatically worse in the last few years. And we have the most unsustainable government finances of any province of Canada now. Like, the spread between revenues and expenditures is wider on a percentage basis than anywhere in Canada. And a shout out to University of Calgary economist Trevor Toon, who writes and speaks about this stuff because it's kind of scary. Now, governments can roll up their sleeves and, with strong economic growth and a bit of cost control, you can bend that curve back pretty fast, but they're not at this point showing the results on that. And so I think when it comes to capital projects, I think there's a role for advocacy to say, we need more schools, we need hospitals, we need bridges and all these things that are publicly financed. There's a better way to do it. We can save money by being creative with our labor strategies, I would think.
Yeah, I would love to know more what you think, and I don't want to take free advice. Obviously you get paid to come up with these strategies and support advocacy like that. But what do you think, Mike? Like, obviously, we hear a lot, like, the debt and deficit. You're right, like it's just ballooned and it's disconnected from our economy. That we're not. It appears to be that we're not driving a private sector economy and growth through a private sector kind of model. That the growth we did have or have had in the past has been more public sector driven, and that's not obviously sustainable long term, as we're hearing from people like Trevor Toon and Jock Finlayson and all those other economists. At the same time, when we look at these deficits, people say, deficits don't matter, no one cares, it's not political. First of all, do you agree with that? Like, deficits don't matter?
Oh no, I'm a fiscal hog. People will argue about the nature of a deficit. What are you borrowing for? Are you borrowing to pay the groceries, or are you borrowing to put a new roof on the house? And right now we're borrowing for the groceries. And we will hit a wall at some point. They keep saying BC's, well, they used to say AAA credit rating. Well, that's not the case anymore. And now they say we have one of the stronger debt to GDP ratios and this side of Saskatoon. But that's not really the case anymore either. We still have a room before we, the IMF declares an emergency. But why would we want to go in that direction? We're going to be spending more on debt servicing for future generations than we ought to, and that means they will be taxed more to get less. So yeah, it's important. And yes, we need capital investment, private sector and public sector investment to keep the economy going, to have the standard of living we want. And this is where I think there's common ground, frankly, between union and non-union, is that, what we saw, like with Christie when she was premier and when she had her hard hat on, it's like she wanted to get stuff built, right? And that's good for everybody. Like, there's lots of work to go around and lots is happening. And that was the criticism of the NDP. And when they opposed the oil pipeline in 2013, it's like they didn't want to get things built. So, like, let's get things built. And I think government has a role to play in detoxifying the labor relations to some degree, to take some of that polarization out. So we do normalize how union and non-union work together. I think Christie, when she was premier, did lower the temperature a bit with private sector unions. And as I mentioned earlier, one of them endorsed her in the election. And although just anecdotally, building trades were like, yeah, Christie's the one who's getting us employed and the NDP seemed to be holding us back. So I think that's something to think about, right? Is how do we all find a way to get these projects done responsibly, cost effectively, work together on them. And sure, there's going to be competition, but that's good, right? As opposed to there's only one way to do it. It should be union.
Or traditional union, which is kind of our point. Like,
I
don't know if you know, like,
of course.
Yeah, well, I've always got to come back to
that affiliated union.
Yeah, and building trades, which makes up, and they don't really argue the number. I don't know if you know, they only make up about 15% of the workforce. And non-union is the largest. But between us and our alternate unions like CLAC partners, and non-unions, we make up 85% of workforce. But then on some of these major sector projects like the Patello Bridge, Cowichan Hospital, which you look at the cost overruns, those two projects alone are probably close to $1 billion in cost overruns because, they only utilize 15% of the workforce. So what happens in that situation? By the government's own admission, they're saying, obviously, there's supply chain issues and that have issues on the cost of a project. But they admit in their own releases that it's labor supply shortages that obviously have a big driving impact. And of course, that's because of their own policy. I guess, again, I don't want to necessarily, get you to have to take a political position here, Mike, but I think
that, yeah.
no, of course not. But I would love to maybe get your take as we kind of, work to wrap up here. As someone who is, obviously been very much in the political sphere as a chief of staff to Premier Clark, you mentioned Site C, how up on that project, the government, Christie, took the position of everybody's going to work on that project. I agree with your point that there's enough work to go around. And then when you restrict the access to, labor, one of two things is you're going to happen. Like you're going to, pay more for that labor at the time being, or you're going to have to defer projects down the line, which then happens, what happens there? Well, cost of material goes up. So you're either going to pay for it up front more because you're restricting labor, or, due to cost of material, you're going to pay more because you can't get every project built at the same time when there's people sitting there wanting to work. How would you approach this as someone in the advocacy space, to help talk to the government? Because obviously the NDP, we've tried to reach out and they don't, necessarily.
Not answering your calls?
Not answering, not getting a lot of phone calls back, and so I would just love to know, like, obviously there's a free enterprise, BC Conservatives, when we didn't even touch on any of that really in terms of the turmoil kind of right now going on in the Conservatives. But just, broadly speaking, how would you kind of
I would say as a general observation over the last 8 years of NDP government that Horgan did a good job of managing the business community into a state of quiet acceptance of a lot of the NDP policies. I think EP's, he's done in fits and starts, but he doesn't have the relationships that Horgan had. And Horgan kind of lulled the business community to perhaps even a complacent position because they had access and they could have those conversations. But really, we look at it 8 years later and there's some very worrying results in terms of the fiscal performance, the sluggish growth, how the government has structured the economy from their standpoint. And so I think, quote Ronald Reagan, peace through strength. Sometimes you got to stand up for yourself and be heard. And now the ICBA, for instance, does a lot of that. And they take a strong position, and we know where they stand, and we know where the NDP stands with regard to ICBA. But I think the key here, from any organization's perspective, is aligning with the public. Where do your values align with the public interest? The public interest, I would argue, is to have particularly publicly financed capital projects done as cost effectively as possible. And you have a case to make about how you can contribute to that and how you can save taxpayers money and bring higher value. I think that's the type of conversation. That's one of the conversations that could be pretty useful, along with the other good things you do in terms of your members providing careers and providing opportunities for people to flourish and get experience and work in the economy. But there's a value proposition when the government's broke and we see these major cost overruns. As why are we doing things this way? There's a better way. Here's something to think about.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's probably a great place to leave it, Mike. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Constructive Thinking. I think you definitely left us with a lot of food for thought, and obviously we'd love to have you back maybe at some other point in a year's time when some of these projects and issues kind of advance a little bit further down and just continue to pick your brain on the BC political landscape.
Okay. Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. Well, that's been another episode of Constructive Thinking. I'm Dan Baxter, and thank you for listening.